he wasn't just the greatest boxer on the planet. Outside the ring, Muhammad Ali was surrounded by breathtaking mansions and cars straight out of a movie. But every steering wheel he turned hid a story, and every wall of his homes held secrets few knew about. Muhammad Ali was much more than a boxing champion. He was a symbol, a man who challenged the system, who spoke out against wars and prejudice, and who left his mark that spanned generations. But beyond the activist and athlete, there was also the man who indulged in luxury, a man who enjoyed feeling the force of powerful engines, strolling through endless gardens, and lying in rooms where every detail was tailored for someone who lived at the top of the world. And it is precisely this contrast that we will delve into, the intimate Ali, who, out of the spotlight, surrounded himself with but also with fragility. Imagine an idol, dressed in impeccable white, walking through the marble living room of a California mansion. Sunlight streams through the windows and reflects off the gilded mirrors, while in the garage, dozens of cars from Cadillacs to Rolls-Royces wait to be displayed like trophies. It wasn't just wealth, it was a reflection of the impact he made on the world. Each mansion he purchased was like a temple to victory. Each car he drove, a reminder that the poor kid from Louisville had achieved the impossible. But behind every luxurious object lay a contradiction. Ali always claimed he didn't care about money, that his mission was greater, and yet he accumulated palaces and collected symbols of power. This leads us to a question that will haunt this entire story. Were these mansions and cars just whims, or were they also part of the mask he wore to face his own internal battles? Today we'll open the doors of these homes. We'll step into their garages, and more than listing material possessions, we'll discover how these objects helped build the legend. Because understanding Muhammad Ali's mansions and cars is, in fact, understanding a piece of the man behind the myth. The scene begins in the early 1960s. Muhammad Ali was still known as Cassius Clay, young, bold, full of confidence, and with a glint in his eye that made any camera fall in love. He had won Olympic gold in Rome, and soon afterward, the world began calling him the kid who talks too much. But he didn't just talk, he delivered on every word. It was in this context, amidst taunts in the ring and newspaper headlines, that he decided to take his first step on the path to luxury. At just 20, Ali bought his first large house, a property that, for many, was already larger than any average Louisville kid's dream. The mansion wasn't just a house, it was a symbol. There he walked through those wide hallways with a smile on his face, repeating to himself, "I said I'd be the greatest, and now I'm living like the greatest." In the gardens, he welcomed friends, curious neighbors, and reporters who wanted to photograph the new boxing star. The garage began to fill with cars that reflected his personality, colorful, extravagant, each with a detail that showed his boldness. Among them, a pink Cadillac, as flashy as his pre-fight proclamations. "I'm the king of the world," he shouted as he turned the key in the ignition and sped off, leaving dust and applause in his wake. But behind this display of grandeur lay something deeper. Ali wasn't content simply to win. He wanted to show the world, and especially himself, that a young black man, born in a humble neighborhood, could have everything that until then had been reserved for the rich and powerful. The pink Cadillac, which seemed like just an extravagant car, was actually a message. "I exist. I make a difference. I'm here to change the rules." Every honk he honked on the streets was almost like a blow to the prejudice he faced daily. Inside the mansion, however, there were also moments of silence. Alone, walking down the hallway lit by golden chandeliers, Ali sometimes wondered if it was really necessary. "Does all this make me greater than I already am?" he murmured in front of the mirror. These doubts were drowned out when friends arrived, when parties began, when laughter filled the room. But deep down there was always a duality. The simple man who claimed not to care about money, and the icon who loved to turn his life into a spectacle. Ali's first palace wasn't just a property purchased with the money from his victories. It was the initial stage where he began to build his mythical image. Ali learned early on that every wall, every car, every luxurious detail could be used to reinforce his legend, and he used it as a weapon, as much as his fists. But if this was just the first mansion, what would come next would make the world believe that Muhammad Ali didn't just collect titles, he collected kingdoms. When fame grows, palaces grow, but can they also house the ghosts that begin to follow a champion? Muhammad Ali's fame grew uncontrollably. Each fight, each victory, each controversial interview increased his global presence. As a result, his mansions multiplied, and his garages became veritable temples of luxury. It was impossible to visit Ali's home and not be impressed. Cars lined up like soldiers ready for a silent war, chrome gleaming in the sunlight, hand-stitched leather seats exuding wealth and exclusivity. There were Rolls-Royces he used for formal occasions, Cadillacs paraded through the city as if part of a show, and even Italian sports cars that showed the world that Ollie didn't just fight in the ring, he also raced against time and against any limit that dared challenge him. One such afternoon, a neighbor recalls seeing Ali pulling out of the driveway in one of his favorite cars, a spotless white Cadillac. He stopped in the middle of the street, rolled down the window, and shouted, "Look, this isn't just my car. It's proof that a black boy from Kentucky can drive higher than any of you imagined." The neighbors applauded, some laughed, others criticized him for showing off. But Ollie knew exactly what he was doing. Every display was calculated. He didn't display luxury just to satisfy personal desires. He displayed it as a form of protest, of affirmation, of cry out against a society that still insisted on limiting dreams. Ali's garages became showcases for photographers and journalists. They didn't just come for boxing interviews. They came to observe the man who transformed cars into political statements. Ollie posed beside his cars as if they were belts. "This here is my Rolls-Royce, and it's not just a car. It's my trophy outside the ring," he would say with that defiant smile, as he stroked the gleaming hood. The roaring engines echoed like war drums, announcing to the world that Ollie wasn't just a boxer, he was a king in his own court. But while the garage gleamed, doubts and concerns grew within him. There he wondered if all this luxury was taking him away from his true self. He remembered the simple streets of Louisville, the bicycle that had once been stolen from him and that, ironically, had led him to boxing. Now, surrounded by cars worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, he reflected, am I still the same boy who cried over his lost bike? Or have I become just the man who buys 10 gold bicycles to hide his pain? This duality constantly accompanied him. From the outside, the public saw a god surrounded by symbols of power. From the inside, he was still a man searching for purpose. And it was precisely during this period that tensions rose. Ollie began to face not only rivals in the ring, but also the government, public opinion, and even invisible enemies who accused him of exaggerating luxury while preaching simplicity in his religious speeches. "You talk about humility, but you parade around in a Rolls," critics asked. He responded with sharp phrases, "Luxury doesn't possess me. I possess it, and when I want, I'll leave all that behind. Because true wealth lies in the courage to be free." It was impossible not to admire that man's courage. But at the same time, it was impossible not to sense the contradiction in his life. With each new car he bought, more criticism arose. With each mansion he acquired, more suspicious glances approached. And yet, Ollie kept accelerating. Because, for him, to stop was to die. This is where you, the person who's been following this story so far, come in. If you believe Muhammad Ali was much more than a fighter, if this insight into the man behind the legend surprises you, like us now, subscribe to the channel, and comment which of Ollie's cars or mansions impresses you most so far. Your comment will help us bring you more impactful stories like this, and to help us continue, buy our ebook from the first link in the description. Besides motivating us, this helps us improve the quality of our content. But make no mistake, this is just the surface. Because as his garages grew, so did the battles outside the ring. In the next chapter we'll delve into the most turbulent phase of Ollie's life, where his luxurious choices collided with political wars, accusations, and a price no Rolls-Royce could afford. At the height of his career, Muhammad Ali no longer just collected rare cars. He accumulated palaces, huge mansions spread across different cities, each with its own style, each reflecting a phase of his life. They were more than just luxury properties. They were fortresses where he prepared for battles that went far beyond the ring ropes. Ollie understood that his private life was watched with the same attention as his fights. Therefore, each house became a stage, each detail a statement. One of his most iconic mansions was in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, a gigantic estate surrounded by immaculate gardens, where illuminated fountains gushed crystal clear water day and night. From the outside it was impossible not to be impressed. Imposing white columns gave the impression of a Roman palace transported to the United States. But what truly caught the eye was inside. He had transformed each room into a portrait of his personality. Huge paintings with photos of him in historic battles, trophies scattered across shelves, luxurious sofas accommodating friends, artists, politicians, and even rivals who visited him to discuss business or simply try to decipher this complex man. This mansion was more than a home. It was a headquarters. It was there that Ali gathered advisors when he refused to fight in the Vietnam War. It was there that he received journalists to deliver explosive statements, surrounded by luxury and firmness. They can take away my titles, they can arrest me, but they won't force me to fight innocent people, he would say, sitting in his marble room, the echo of his voice echoing through the corridors. It was an almost cinematic scene, a black man, persecuted by the government, resisting inside a palace that seemed to defy all social logic of the time. And while the world judged him, his possessions became the target of fierce criticism. For some, his mansions were symbols of hypocrisy. How can you talk about defending the poor while living in palaces? They asked. But for Ollie, each mansion was not an empty act of ostentation, it was a trophy snatched from the hands of a system that didn't want him there. He himself said, "It's not about the gold of the chandeliers or the size of the beds. It's about the right to be where they said I could never be." In these homes, Ali experienced moments of grandeur, but also of profound solitude. There were nights when he walked alone through the silent hallways, the dimmed chandeliers more reminiscent of a gilded prison than a home. He stared at his reflection in giant mirrors and asked himself, "Do I own all this? Or does all this own me?" This phrase echoed not only in Ollie's mind, but also in the hearts of those who accompanied him, because, behind the image of the champion, there was a man who carried doubts, fears, and the eternal search for meaning. Close friends report that Ali often received unexpected visits from poor young people who knocked on the door of his mansion just to see him, and instead of kicking them out, he would open the doors, offer them food, show them his cars, and make a point of inspiring them. "Look, kids, I came from nothing. If I could make it this far, you can too. But never forget, none of this is worth more than your word and your courage." These encounters transformed his mansion into something beyond luxury. They became life lessons. Over time, Ollie's mansions became living metaphors for his journey. They were fortresses, but also prisons. They were stages for grand parties, but also quiet refuges where he faced internal battles no adversary could see. Ollie used luxury as a shield, but every brick of his homes also bore invisible scars. And it is in this contrast that the story progresses. Because if his homes were temples of power, the next chapter reveals how his own fortune would become a weapon against him. The pressure mounted, the bills mounted, and his enemies knew that attacking the man was difficult, but attacking his assets could shake even Muhammad Ali. As the years passed, Muhammad Ali's life was no longer marked solely by the gleam of his belt or the speed of his jabs. Something bigger was happening. The mansions that once symbolized victory began to weigh down his shoulders like chains. The same luxury he once wore as a banner of pride began to be used as ammunition against his image. Politicians, critics, and even journalists who had once applauded him now used his homes and cars as an argument to accuse him of contradiction. "A man who speaks of humility, but lives in palaces fit for kings," they said. This narrative, repeated in newspapers and on television, began to create rifts not only in public opinion but also within his inner circle. The costs were impossible to ignore. Maintaining several mansions, spread across different states, required an army of employees, gardeners, security guards, drivers, cooks. The monthly bills reached levels that even a world champion was beginning to feel. There were lavish parties, receptions for dignitaries, political meetings, and even secret meetings where Ali tried to balance his life as an athlete with his role as a cultural icon and activist. But every party was expensive, every dinner made headlines, and every new acquisition was transformed into ammunition against his image as a champion of the marginalized. Within these marble walls, intense arguments also took place. Friends and family report that Ollie would often rise from the table in anger. When someone suggested selling a property or downsizing, "I'm not going back to living small just because they want me to," he would shout. It was his way of resisting, of proving that nothing would bring him back to square one. But in the silence of the night, alone in a vast room, he would stare at the ceiling and wonder if he wasn't fighting invisible enemies not in the ring, but in the weight of his accumulated wealth. Even his garages, once temples of pride, became scenes of questioning. There he walked among his cars, running his hand over the shiny hood of a Rolls-Royce or the leather steering wheel of a Cadillac. But instead of joy, he felt a tightness in his chest. How many families could live on the price of one of these? He murmured. He knew his luxurious life was being scrutinized. He knew every choice could be used against him, and yet he wouldn't give up, accelerating hard on a deserted road, feeling the wind on his face, as if speed were the only way to escape the pressure. The mansions also began to reveal another side, vulnerability. There Ali recovered from painful defeats, hid tears he never showed publicly, and faced the first signs of his body taking the toll of years of struggle. The gilded corridors, the sparkling chandeliers, the endless pools all seemed insufficient to hide the physical and emotional pain. It was there, in the gigantic beds and luxurious rooms, that he endured sleepless nights, reflecting on who he truly was. The criticism was relentless. Newspapers printed photos of his homes with ironic captions. Television programs showed footage of his parties as if they were proof of a life disconnected from reality. Ollie would respond with sharp phrases. They want me to live like a slave while they live like kings. No, I will live like a king so that every young black man knows they can be a king too. His words resonated, inspiring many, but also divided opinions. For some, he was a hypocrite. For others, a hero who dared to occupy spaces denied to him. And in this whirlwind, something began to shift. Ollie began to realize that luxury, once a symbol of victory, was becoming his greatest battle outside the ring. It was no longer just about fighting Frazier or Foreman. It was about fighting a narrative that tried to diminish his essence. And for the first time, he realized that perhaps the real enemy wasn't the government, the press, or the critics. Perhaps it was the very weight of the golden crowns he insisted on carrying. That this realization opened the way for a new chapter in his life. Because when a man understands that his palaces can also be prisons, he begins to seek something beyond the marble walls. In the next chapter, we'll see how Muhammad Ali transformed his relationship with his mansions and cars into something greater, not just symbols of wealth, but tools of legacy, capable of inspiring generations long after their engines had stopped and the lights in their homes had gone out. As the years passed, Muhammad Ali was no longer just the champion the world knew. His body, scarred by epic battles, began to take a heavy toll. The trembling hands, the speech difficulties, the fatigue that once seemed unimaginable. But even when his voice failed, his homes and cars continued to speak for him. His mansions, scattered like fortresses across America, were no longer just symbols of material conquest. They became living monuments to the story of a man who dared to go beyond boxing. Ollie understood, deep down, that those palaces and those luxurious machines would not be remembered merely as extravagances, but as chapters in a larger narrative, that of a man who made the impossible routine. At his home in Berrien Springs, Michigan, perhaps the most iconic of his properties, Ali found refuge during the quieter years of his life. The immense estate, surrounded by rivers and woods, resembled more of a spiritual retreat than an ostentatious mansion. Ollie enjoyed walking through the gardens, even when his body no longer responded as it once did. It was there that he welcomed fans, young and old, who came from all over the world to see the legend up close. Some arrived expecting only shiny cars in the garage or gilded salons, but they left struck by something much greater, the simplicity and humanity of a man who, sitting on a vast porch, smiled humbly and uttered phrases that would last forever. Even in his weakened state, Ollie made a point of showing off his cars. He'd take visitors to his garage, run his hand over the steering wheel of a vintage Rolls-Royce or an impeccably maintained Cadillac, and say, "This isn't just a car, it's proof that once upon a time, a poor kid from Louisville could conquer the world." It wasn't ostentation, it was a lesson. It was a living reminder that victory isn't just about what you achieve, but about what you represent to others. His cars and mansions became part of the myth, but they also became tools of inspiration. Schools, community centers, and social organizations often drew inspiration from Ollie's name to show poor children that it was possible to dream big. Some of his properties, after his departure, were transformed into tourist attractions, places where people visited not just to see luxury but to feel the energy of a man who refused to be just another athlete. Ollie was aware of this. He knew that, in the future, every wall of his mansions and every detail of his cars would be remembered as pieces of his fight against prejudice, poverty, and the limitations imposed by the world. But there was something deeper. To those closest to him, Ollie said that his material possessions never defined him, that the mansions and cars were merely passing symbols. He always repeated, "What matters is not what you have, but what you leave behind when you go." And indeed, his true legacy wasn't the Golden Gates or the roaring engines. It was the impact he made on people. It was the inspiration that made millions believe they could be greater than their circumstances. It was the courage to say no to unjust wars, even when he lost everything. It was the strength to keep smiling, even when his voice no longer accompanied his ideas. The last images many have of Ollie aren't of him driving a luxury car or strolling through giant mansions. They're of him sitting, frail, but still with his eyes shining. A man who, even silently, conveyed more than any speech. His cars and houses, remain, but his spirit continues to travel, crossing borders and centuries. And it is at this point that the story finds its resolution. Because Muhammad Ali didn't just collect cars or build just palaces, he collected dreams, he built hopes. His material possessions were, yes, grand, but Ali's true luxury was living with intensity, courage, and truth. When his engines stopped and the lights of his mansions went out, what remained was not ostentation, it was the certainty that, in life, he fulfilled his own prophecy. He was, is, and always will be the greatest.